Okay, so this here is going to be the first video in a two-parter, sort of explaining some of the advanced joint layout on our girl geometry, and sort of fixing that up and getting it ready to skin and build controls on, sort of like we've done with our spine, and continue to go from there. So again, I have my spine sort of set up here, right? I have these controls laid out, so this is probably the point that you should be at if you're looking at this video. If you're a little ahead of this, you might want to check the second video. But aside from that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, let's take a little bit of an overview and examine what we're going to actually be doing with this layout. So the big one to think about is using the projected centering option in our Create Joint tool. And that's going to allow us to place the joints inside the actual mesh, right? So as opposed to going in through the orthographic views, we can go in through our perspective view and place the joints where we think they should be, and Maya will do its best guess to try and place those joints where it thinks it should go. And usually it's fairly accurate and requires a lot less dialing in and sort of noodling than it would if we, went in through our side and front views and tried to get those placed that way. So we'll be using that to place those joints down. So we'll be making a couple of different limbs. Not only our arm, including a collarbone now, but we'll also do our leg and a jaw as well, and a chin. And we're also going to be looking at an eye joint later on as well. But the big one that we're going to be going over, and it's probably going to take the most time in this lesson, is going over laying out finger bones. We have a couple of tips and tricks that we can do to speed this up and make it a lot easier on us once it's time to go through our layout. But yeah, we'll be laying out our joints, we'll be fixing them. Hopefully at this point, laying some joints out and orienting them appropriately should be review at this point, and we're just going to get a little more practice in doing that with an actual mesh, right? So let's go ahead and get started. So the first order of business, as we saw, is to go ahead and lay out some joints with the projected centering tool. So I'm going to go make sure that my menu sets are set to rigging, because that's what we're doing, as well as make sure my shelf tab is set to rigging. So yeah, not poly modeling, which probably is on by default, but instead we're going to go to rigging. And we'll go ahead and click on a Create Joint tool. And I'll even double click on this so I can get my tool settings open. And what I'm looking for down here is this projected centering box, right? So I want to take this on. I'm going to use this to the best of my ability to help get these placed down. And now, the first thing I'm going to do is show you what might go wrong, right? So maybe I come in here and place a bone. I want projected centering to be on, so let's click and place a bone. Okay, sure, this is working. No, it's not. You can see here I put it out behind here, and that's because my display layer is still set to R or restricted. So if you turn on projected centering, and even though this looks right, like if I try and get this back at an angle, right, even though this looks right, it's going to put it out in the void because this is restricted. Because of that restriction, Maya's not going to actually be able to use the mesh to reference a place to put our joints down. So make sure that R is ticked off and shows a blank box. So not a T, not a R, but we want that to be a blank box. All right, let's place our clavicle bones down. I'm also wanting to do a shoulder, an elbow, a wrist, and a small hand joint. So again, I'm going to click in here and grab up to my shoulder, down to where I think the elbow would be. I think that's okay. Then where my wrist is, and then that last joint here on the hand. And after I'm done placing my joint train out, I'll just hit enter. As you can see here, because of that projected centering being on, we're actually able to put our joints inside the mesh pretty well, pretty realistically. And we can even see we have like a slight bend in this pose, right? Like these aren't going straight out like on our bony rigs or other layouts, but it's instead sort of following the bend of the elbow. And much like with our other joint layouts, we can adjust those later, but let's go ahead and get our stuff laid out first on our arms and legs, as well as our jaw, and then we can go ahead and go from there. So again, I still have projected centering on. I'll just grab my joint tool down here because I used it last. If you can't grab it, just go up to the top of your rigging shelf and grab it there. Next, I want to add a hip, a knee, an ankle, a ball of the foot, and a toe. So like we've done before with our bony rigs. I'll click right in here because this feels like a good spot for the hip to be. A little down to where the knee should bend, roughly, probably right around here. Get inside the ankle. And if this layout is a little messed up, we can go back and fix it later, right? And even for the ball of the foot, I might go to the side ortho because that might just work out a little bit better for me. So again, I hit spacebar to open those four views, held my cursor over the side view and tap spacebar again. I'm just going to go in and place a ball right where the ball of the foot is, and then place one sort of at the tippy toe of the foot. And I'll hit enter again, which creates that joint chain, and I can start manipulating them. So I'm feeling pretty good about this layout. There are a couple of tweaks that I want to make, the big one being the clavicle being pulled forward. And, oh, before I forget and go any further, you do need to make sure that if you check your tool settings for both your move and rotate tools, you do want the axis orientation set to object, because that's just going to make things a little bit more easy for us to manipulate things. You can do it in world space, but I highly recommend this, especially as we begin to adjust our fingers in our ankles and in, if we adjust the joints elsewhere. It just might be a little bit easier with it aligned like that. But that said, let's go in here and move our clavicle forward. Again, we want to go for the most anatomically accurate representation as we can get. So I'll hit D as in dog on my keyboard and use some of my manipulators to bring this actually forward up to where her collarbone is, right? I might even turn off X-ray to get this as close as I can to the skin without it protruding through like this. I put it back a little bit. Maybe go up a little bit that way. And you can spend as long as you'd like to nitpick here and get it as realistic as you can. But I'm okay with that now. That's just a lot closer to the actual front of her torso. So I got that clavicle in place, and I'm feeling good about that. My shoulder's fine. My elbow is mostly fine. I might hit D as in dog with that selected to just bring it down a little bit further on the bend. And this is up to your discretion on where you want your joints to be placed, right? I do want you to try and get this hand joint at the end of your arm chain to sort of be in the middle of the hand and make sure that the wrist is up where the wrist would actually bend and deform on a real human body. And of course, if you're unsure where that should go, you do have yourself as reference. So just hold out a hand, wiggle your wrists around, twist your hand, flex and extend your elbow. Think about that flexion and extension, that abduction, that adduction motion to see what would look right. I'm going to go down and fix my legs next. And I'm just going to grab the knee and probably bring it over. And you can alternate between different views here. Basically find what sort of workflow works best for you in getting your joints laid out. And I might pull this back just a little bit since the knee bends in the center of the leg, not towards the front of the leg. And I'll keep trucking down. Same goes for the ankle. I might bring this forward a little bit. And up and into the center just a little bit more. And I can sort of even see on the geometry where my ankle protrudes out. So I think that sort of splits the difference between both of those little mounds on the side of her leg. And, okay. Now something I do want to do is I want to make sure my ball and my toe are sort of aligned with each other, and that I'm sort of following the general direction of my entire leg chain. So I'll probably move my toe over a little bit. And since it's at the end of the chain, I'm just going to move it. I'm not necessarily going to use D as in dog to grab it. But further up the chain, I might use D to scoot this just back ever so slightly. So this is a little more straight. And if your toe joint ends up being like outside of the mesh, right, in this instance, that's going to be okay. We're going to use it to hold different controls for us a lot later on in building this rig. So you don't have to be as specific with it. I might put it back onto the middle toe just in case, but unlike with the clavicle, I do just want to point out that it is okay if this protrudes out just a little bit. All right, so we've got those laid out. We use our projected centering to help us, and we'll go ahead and take that technique into our fingers. So we could go in with our create joint tool and sort of grab our hand and try and sort of noodle with the camera and put things down this way. And like, this is fine, right? This is one way we could go about laying out our joints, but I want to be a little more specific with these, especially because, you know, the hand's a more delicate organ, and it would probably help us to pay a little bit more of attention to where the bones are and where these will deform. So I'll delete these for now, and I'll show you a little trick to sort of get in here and isolate the fingers one at a time so you can work on them that way. So the solution is pretty easy. All I'm just going to do is single click on my mesh. Again, this is not restricted because if it was, I couldn't grab my mesh. So I'm going to single click my mesh, and I'm going to go into faces mode. If you're familiar with modeling, this should be pretty easy to jump to. But if you're not, you can go to that a couple of different ways. The first one being your modeling toolkit over here on the side. That's just with the My Classic workspace, so if it's not visible, you can choose that workspace, it'll probably pop up. And you can go over here to faces. Now my mesh turns blue and I can grab the faces. Or I can just right click on the mesh and choose this little pick whip, hover it down onto face after I hold down right click and release on top of that. And even because my camera's sort of like zoomed out and it's not quite focused on what it needs to be, I can even grab a face here and hit F to find it or frame it. And now my camera sort of rotates around the finger and I can get a little more in here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the two faces on the fingertips and I'm going to grow my selection so I can sort of grab the whole finger. And let's see what that looks like. So just left click on my first fingertip, hold down shift to increase my selection and grab my fingertip on the other face. Let's go ahead and hold down a little combination on our keyboard. It's going to be shift and then the period key or the shift and greater than sign to grow our selection. Notice that it increases the amount of face that I have grabbed and it just does it relative to the finger. So I can even hit that a lot more and go all the way up my hand so I can sort of solo these out and grab them. I'll even go one further so I can see all of the knuckles in the finger. So again, I grabbed up here to roughly where that knuckle would be as well as the rest of them along the finger. Now that I have those actual faces grabbed, we can isolate them in our viewport. And much like with many things in Maya, we can go about that a couple of different ways. The first one being a simple key command, with that key command being Control-1 or Command-1 if you're on Mac. And you'll even see it toggle up here, but there's a little option at the top of your viewport. When you hover over it, it says Isolate Select. It basically looks like a cursor pointing at a little blue ticked box. So we can also select that as well to isolate what we have selected. And now we have our finger pulled out in front of the other fingers. And again, nothing's been deleted. This is just sort of a viewport toggle as a way of hiding all the other different elements in our viewport. It just allows us to get in a little closer. Now that I have this soloed out, I'll hold down right click on this again and mouse over to object mode so I can't grab any of these faces by accident. Now I can go in with my create joint tool and I'll double click it to bring open the options again. Projected centering, it still is on. And while I'm here, I'll change my short bone radius, not the length or the long bone length or radius, but just the short bone radius. I'm going to take this down a little bit because as we saw earlier, at this current size, my finger joints will be huge. So I'll go down to 0.35 and this will probably make it a little more manageable of a size to work with as we're placing our joints down. All right, so let's start clicking. And again, you can hit F on your keyboard to frame your selection. So our camera will rotate pretty much perfectly around this and we'll start clicking and adding our joints where they should be. Click on there, go down to my knuckle, the last knuckle. And I do want to make a bone for my fingertip, so I'm going to click past here to the tip of the finger, so I grab 3 knuckles and a fingertip. And this is both the boon and the bane that comes with working with projected centering, is that sometimes when Maya does its best to guess, is that it's not entirely correct. But it looks like it's just this being pulled out of alignment. So again, I had you change your axis orientation to object, so it'll make it a lot easier to scoot this into place. So all I have to do is grab this handle on the object's y-axis and point it in. And bam. So similarly, I'll grab my other move tools and use this to reposition this inside finger as it should be. I can use that D as in dog to manipulate just the single bone, not the whole hierarchy as well, to get this lined up and looking a bit better. So I'm okay with that for now. I'll turn off my isolate select by hitting Control-1 or hitting that button again so I can see where it sits relative to the rest of the hand. But the reason we do this right is because if I'm trying to add bones to my middle finger, but I'm starting to click through here and I accidentally land up on my ring finger behind here, now this joint chain is not looking correct at all. So we want to use that projected centering in combination with the isolate select to help us just get our joints closer to where they need to be the first time we place them. It's not necessary for the layout, but I highly recommend it as it's a great way to speed up your workflow a little bit. So I'll go ahead and repeat that process for the other finger, the middle finger. I'll right click it and hold down to face, grab the two faces on the fingertip, and I'll hold down shift and period and grow my selection. Solo it out. And once I have this grabbed, again, I'll hold down right click and go to object mode. And now we're ready to start placing our bones. Again, where I think the knuckle would be, the next knuckle, third one, down to the fingertip. Again, I can hit enter when I'm done. And it looks like it's already placed it how I'd like it to be. It's looking a little weird right in here, so maybe I might use D as in dog to just scoot this knuckle over ever so slightly. Maybe the one above it too. I promise I won't spend all day on this. You can, again, get as nitpicky with this as you'd like to be, because the more anatomically accurate these joints are placed, the better your deformations will look once we finally skin this up to our joints. But I'm okay with that for now. And yeah, I vaguely want my knuckles to be aligned in the same place because that's how they are in my hand. So I'm okay with this placement. I might even use D as in dog again to scoot this over just a little bit. So that's how we do those fingers. I'm going to go ahead and speed up here just to expedite this video. But I'll be using the same tactic for all of the other fingers as well as the thumb. I do just want to point out that the thumb is going to use one less joint because, well, the thumb in real life has one less joint. So let's go ahead and jump forward a little bit. I'll speed through this section and I'll see you on the other side. I just want to take a quick moment to pause here and say that I did grab too many faces on the selection, and a way to remedy that is just to hold down Control on your keyboard. Your cursor will get a little minus symbol, so it allows you to subtract from it, because again, Shift brings that plus up, and then minus, or Control brings the minus up as well. And if you do hold Shift over an area you already have selected, it does bring up that minus too, but I prefer Control because it will just subtract no matter what. So I'll just grab this so I grab a little less of the palm, oops, and continue working on the thumb. Alright, so I'm feeling okay about my fingers for now. I'm enjoying that layout. So let's go ahead and wrap this up by grabbing the jaw and the eye. We'll rename our joints after that, and that'll be a good sort of halfway point to stop this video at. So for my jaw, I'm going to go over here, tap space, and go into the orthographic side. Because the jaw is smack dab in the middle of our geometry, I can just make it over here on this ortho, and it should put it in the middle of the geometry. No projected centering required. So I'll just click here right where the jaw meets the ear, right? So sort of where that hinges in your skull. And I might even make my short bone radius a little bit bigger now, right? Maybe 0.75. Because I don't need it to be as small as my fingers. Yeah, that'll work. Hit enter to make it. And you can see here that it is right on that line of symmetry. Straight up and down on my ortho front. And again, we do want everything to be up and down, correctly symmetrical. So that's what doing it, or making our bones on the side does for us. Lastly, we'll do the eye, and we'll go ahead and clean up our joints with some renaming. But I'll show you a little trick here to help get things centered up on geometry like this. So if we go over to our outliner, we'll look and see that the girl geo actually has its own separate LT and RT eyes. So I'll select my eyes geo, and I'll use that isolate select, that control 1, to solo it out so I can get in here. So just to double check, your pivot point may not be in the center of this eyeball, right? So like if my pivot point were further back, it would rotate perhaps a little bit differently around that point, right? But what I want is for that pivot to be centered. And you can do so by just going up to modify center pivot. I just want to make sure that that's dead in the middle of our eyeball because we'll be using that pivot to snap another joint to it. So the little trick that I'm talking about is to basically collapse this eyeball in on itself, black hole style, create a little singularity of where a bunch of vertices sit on top of each other, and we can snap to those vertices with our joint tool. So I'll be doing that by scaling things down to 0. Again, I need my pivot to be centered so it basically goes in on this pivot point. Can't really dial it in with our scale tool either. You can try, but you'll probably mess it up. So let's just use our channel box instead to zero all these values out. So click on my scale x1 over in the 1 value, hold down shift and grab down to Z so I can grab everything in between it, type in 0 and enter. So again, I have this little manipulator here, right, that's in the middle of the screen, but there's nothing there because of the 0 scale. It's basically just a ton of vertices sitting on top of each other in this space. And we have, again, like black hole style, collapsed it in on itself. So now to make the actual eye, I'll just grab my joint tool, and what I'll do is hold V as in Victor on my keyboard and snap to points. And you can click pretty much anywhere on here and it should snap it. But just to be safe, you might want to hold down V and try and click vaguely where you think the eyes are Like with my move tool, I can sort of guesstimate where it is. So now I'll hold down V and plink it down. All right. Now let's go ahead and select our LT eyes geo and bring it back up to 1 scale. Oops. And again, you don't need to do this with the right side. The whole reason we're working on all of the left side of the body, right, is to just flip these over once we're done. We do have like a random joint hanging out. So yeah, I made an extra one. I'm just going to delete that. Okay, so our joints are laid out. Let's go ahead and finish things up by using our rename tools to get these all renamed and become appropriate. So some of these I'll have to do by hand. The others I can use some Comet joint rename to help me save a few clicks. So I'll start with my arm and I'll bring up my rename tool just so I can have it and I can use it as need be. I'm wanting to go down the chain and grab clavicle, my shoulder to be the shoulder, next down to the elbow for being the elbow, after that the wrist, and finally the hand. I'll do the same with my hip. So hip, knee, ankle. Now after that is the ball of the foot, so ball, and then toe. Hopefully this should be review. Again, at this point, you should have practiced this on your bony rigs for both the assignment and in class, so these naming conventions should be familiar to you. And you'll notice that I haven't put on LT yet. I'm going to save that for last so I can do it with one click in my Comet rename tool. And we can even do a different way through Maya that I'll show you as well. But this is where Comet rename excels because I can rename all of these at the same time and number them using that rename and number function, so I don't have to type in thumb 1, thumb 2, thumb 3 all the time. So I'll just select everything in the hierarchy for my thumb. Over in the rename and number section, I'll type in thumb, leave my start number at 1 and my padding at 0, so it just renames things incrementally for me, and I'll rename a number. Now over here in my outliner, the thumb 1, 2, and 3 have been renamed. Let's go ahead and repeat that for the index. I'll grab this joint here. I'll use my select hierarchy this time to grab everything, because why not? Change our rename name to index instead. And taking a look, we have index 1 through 4, which is exactly what we want. Let's go ahead and do that for the middle. So again, I'll grab this joint, select hierarchy, type in middle, double check it. All right. And I'll go in through the through the outliner here to grab the hierarchy. Again, it doesn't matter how you do this selection as long as you grab this joint up here first and this one last. Select hierarchy automatically does that for you, and that just makes it so our rename works as it should. So middle is now ring. Rename that number. And finally, we'll do pinky. Again, there's some controversy on how to spell this. You can do P-I-N-K-I-E or P-I-N-K-Y. That's entirely up to you, but if you do find something, go ahead and stick with it. All right. And then I'll grab my eye and my jaw last but not least. Jaw is pretty easy since there's no left or right to mirror the jaw. We'll just do jaw 1 and jaw 2. And then we'll make the eye LT underscore I because we will need to flip that over. And before we go any further, I am going to add LT to the prefix or as a prefix to all of my stuff on the left side, to all my joints on the left side. And I'll do it a couple of different ways. So I'll practice with the fingers through the Maya way, and then we'll use the rest from the Comet rename tool. So what I'll do is I'll grab my thumb up to my index, we'll say. I'll select hierarchy to make sure everything is underneath it. And I'll go up to the modify menu and down to prefix hierarchy names. And this is a lot like the Comet rename tool. The result is exactly the same. This just saves us a few clicks because I can leave this field open in my Comet rename tool. I'll type in LT underscore, and when I hit OK, like this window from Maya will go away, but my Comet rename tool will not. So that's one way to go about it. Once I hit OK, everything has been renamed with LT as a prefix, and that's going down the hierarchy for everything. Great. This time I'll use Comet rename and add my prefix as LT underscore. All right. So it looks like everything has been renamed as we need it to. So we'll go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll come back and take a look at orienting these up and parenting them, getting it mirrored over, which again will be reviewed at this point, So hopefully it should be coming pretty easy to you, and we'll see you then.